Hi, and welcome to our latest podcast episode. At Bridge C14, we're always looking to expand our content, and today is no exception. I'm Lauren Clark, President and CEO of Bridge C14. On today's episode, I'll sit down with Jeff Corcoran, founder of Kinwood, the Celebration of Life company. I've gotten to know Jeff better through our mutual interest in supporting individuals through medical assistance in dying and in the end of life and grief and bereavement space. After working together on 2 projects now, I can certainly attest that the staff at Kinwood are not only experienced, but also passionate and creative professionals who really do use their expertise and knowledge to develop modern bereavement services. I should admit, though, I didn't ask Jeff to come on today to talk about bereavement. What I'm really hoping to gain, knowing his background in marketing and communications, was the opportunity to really look at how public attitudes can evolve on sensitive topics that sometimes actually conflict with moral or religious beliefs. We'll focus on the shift in public attitudes in the context of topics such as decriminalization of cannabis, same-sex marriage, and how MAiD fits into the picture. Sit back and enjoy. Welcome, Jeff. I'm curious, what has market research shown us over the years?
Thanks, Lauren. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. Well, I have a background in marketing, and as part of that, I certainly have a background in market research, and I've ran market research for a couple large organizations. And market research is often used by companies and individuals to understand a whole variety of business or political or societal issues. And and a lot of companies use this research to be able to talk effectively to whether it's customers or voters or people within their networks. And, so I certainly have lots of friends still in the market research business, and I've had significant experience there. And I know a lot of companies right now, as an example, from a business perspective, have used, the COVID pandemic has really instituted a lot of behavioral changes as a society all around the world. And, and a lot of businesses invest in market research to understand a variety of behavior changes, things like online shopping, home nesting, how people's recreation spending has changed. And so with all of that, I thought it would be an interesting exercise to sort of look at the evolution of a bunch of comparable topics to medical assistance in dying as it compares to other topics that we've looked at over the last 30 or 40 years. I think one of the very interesting things from a market research perspective about MAiD and looking at some of the attitudes, MAiD for some people runs up against some religious or moral values to certain segments of the population. And I think if you look back at other comparable topics, something like cannabis, it's really interesting to see the evolution of public support for cannabis. So in 1969, in North America, these are all stats from the Pew Research Institute. In 1969, support for legalization of cannabis was 12%, with 84% opposed. 30 years later, that number moved a little bit, 63% opposed, and only 31% of people supported. And 40 years later, in 2009, those numbers really didn't move very much at all. And it really wasn't until 50 years later, in 2019, that the entire dynamic of the support of legalized marijuana and cannabis changed. So in 2019, we have a support of around 67% and oppose of 32%. So that is really a 180 change, really in just 10 years. And, I think why, the question for a lot of people, a lot of businesses are why. And I think for a lot of these topics that run up against some moral questions, usually personal experience with these issues informs people and changes their attitudes. The legalization of cannabis certainly had, I think, a great impact in the opposition and the reduction of opposition to this. And just, when we see things in popular culture as well, that has a chance to soften some of the sharp edges of some of these issues. So looking at cannabis, the cannabis research has been around for a long time because cannabis has been around for a long time. The interesting one to look at is same-sex marriage. So again, this is a controversial because it mixes in over religious beliefs for some. And, we've got some research on this in the last 15 years. The support for same-sex marriage in 2004 was 31%, with opposition around 60%. And 15 years later, that number is entirely flipped. So support now is over 60%, and opposition is around 30%. And because of the change in society and attitudes, there has been a whole new view and a whole new industry that pops up for businesses and organizations who are supporting gay marriage or offering service to this constituency. And, it's drastically flipped. And I think it's really interesting to look again at why people's attitudes have changed. And I think, certainly there's a very interesting podcast I listened to recently with Malcolm Gladwell, and they were talking about the importance of will and grace as related to the acceptance of same-sex marriage. And, if people know people in their community, for example, who were in a same-sex relationship, I think a lot of the stigma and any moral or religious attitudes that people, may have grown up with are largely dissipated when, confronted the reality of the situation. Whether you're straight or you're gay, you certainly love the same way. And I think once, society and people understand that, a lot of the stigma and the objections for things like gay marriage certainly become less important to a lot of people.
Right. And I think that's really interesting as well when you look at that and that shift both with both of those categories, and these are all very taboo subjects, right? And it's how do you break that? And I think you're right that public acceptance comes when we do accept it and we look at it differently and we change our perspectives on some of these issues.
I mean, it was only 40, 50 years ago. I know in Ontario, we still had alcohol sales prohibited on Sundays. And I think even today that seems rather quaint, but there was a lot of public support for the abolishment of alcohol entirely from society, and then certainly on Sundays as well. I know attitudes around other subjects like gambling, for instance. I mean, gambling was prohibited, and now there's multiple casinos all across Canada, and you can all these commercials online to do it as well. So again, some of these topics, just with exposure and being out and being a topic of conversation, can really help public acceptance of these. So it's interesting to then look with some of those attitudes as it relates to, and MAiD is really interesting. In Canada, I think being a leader in MAiD, I think our population certainly has a very progressive attitude as it relates to this. I know in 2020, an Ipsos did a major study with regard to support for medical assistance in dying in Canada. And at that time, it's an Ipsos poll, 2% of Canadians believe people diagnosed with grievous and medical conditions, including those with dementia, should be allowed to make advanced requests for medical assistance in dying. And I think that support overall is really strong, whether it's from a political or a religious background, no matter what your background is. So I know 86% of Catholics and 80% of Protestants also support medical assistance in dying. So it's that consistency is really strong. I'm interested in your views here, Lauren, but I think when you look at medical assistance of dying, there certainly has been a lot of support, it seems like, from the outset overall, but obviously, there will still be some outliers. What's been your experience in this?
The same. And we can see that, and we see the conversations happening more. We know certainly the media has grabbed onto this, and I think the conversations and putting it at the forefront, right? And acknowledging that medical assistance in dying exists. It is legal, and we need to talk about it because people do want to talk about it. And when you talk about, sometimes it's our exposure to it, and you're right. I think a lot of us, when we're in this world, this is what we know. But for those who are coming in and this is their first experience, to know that they're not alone and that there are those who do support this, and that it doesn't have to be a conversation that they have to hold in it with shame, or or have to tiptoe around, because there are so many people who have been touched by MAiD in some way, shape, or form. And I think that's the thing, is that it really has been strongly supported. Certainly the changes in the legislation with Bill C7 has come with a bit more criticism, and you will see both sides of things. But I think for the most part, Canadians really do understand and appreciate why MAiD exists. And when we look internationally, has become a stronger conversation. And again, that's where it starts, right? Is just having that knowledge and appreciation for it, and the information that goes along with it, right?
Exactly. Yeah. It's funny, even if you look at because sometimes some of these issues can have some sort of political overtones in nature, but all the major political, like if you identify as a member of one of the three major political parties, the NDP, the Liberal Party, or the Conservative Party, support for MAiD in all three of those political affiliations are all over 80% as well. So to have that sort of, broad-based support certainly means that I think, as best can be said for politicians, they're certainly not, making MAiD a sort of a wedge issue in any way with that support, which I think is really progressive and amazing. Also of note is generally with the baby boomers, the levels of support generally increase with age as it relates to MAiD as well. And again, I think that's got a lot to do with just the awareness and some of the interactions that you have, and because MAiD represents now a notable percentage of all deaths in Canada, that it's, if you haven't been touched by it by now, it's going to be, you will eventually be touched by it, and then in the years to come, for sure.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And I think you can see that the shift, I think, even over the last 6 years, and that level of support, and but I can think back to 2016, and it was, there were a lot of question marks. And I think now our understanding is better, and people are going to be, as you said, they are going to be touched by this. We believe that at least 1 in 50 Canadians will be touched by MAiD at some point in time. And I think we could even look at that and argue that it may even be closer to 1 in 25, because the volume of requests is going up, and the ripple effect that has, not only for the individual who's requesting MAiD, but for those who are also connected to them, whether that be their formal supports or their informal supports. And so, you can see that going further and further. And I love to think that, in 5 years, it's going to be one of those conversations people have around the dinner table, right? And it's not going to be, oh, so and so, and it will be somebody, this will be part of our life in many ways, and how we approach death and dying as well in Canada.
Yeah, for sure. And just to build on what you're saying, I mean, there already is a major shift going on in values and attitudes around death and bereavement overall. And a lot of this sort of gets intertwined with religious participation as well. And I know I believe religious participation today in Canada is around 50%, and in 1990 that figure was over 70%. So again, with people, with church and religion becoming less important for a segment of the population, I think you're seeing some of the objections, whether it be to same-sex marriage or to cannabis or some of these these other issues, the support for those issues continues to increase. And I would view that that will only continue, and that's how these trends work. They don't usually regress, they keep progressing. I also know that when you look at religious participation, it also has an impact on things like funerals, for example. So many people today aren't looking for a church or religious funeral. Some people still do, obviously, but those numbers are declining overall. We know our research says that about 23% of respondents are looking for a traditional funeral, or 47% prefer something more personalized, something smaller, often something that is tethered to a celebration of life. And have you seen any of that in in your experience, Lauren, with with your work?
Absolutely. And I think COVID as well had an impact on this. And I think for many people it's less of a priority for them to have that, and they would rather do something like a celebration of life. And it's interesting, right? Because and for some they say, well, I need that formality of and ritual of a funeral for it to feel real. And others say, you know what, I'm looking at things with open eyes now and approaching the concept of death differently than maybe we had years ago. And I think that that's also been that shift in terms of this and that planning aspect, right? It's been really fascinating to see, and it will be interesting to see as well as we, you know, move forward and the years, is where does that sort of that number lie, and is this going to be one of those true shifts where we may even see, those who are wanting a funeral to be even less than 20%. And I'm curious, right?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think you can sort of look to even what's happened in the burial versus attitudes around burial and cremation. In I think in the cremation rate for Canada right around today is about 70%, and 20 years ago that number was 50%. I think in the U.S. the number it's about 55%. People prefer to be cremated, but those numbers are heading in the direction of Canada as well. So again, to your point, it's difficult to sort of to see. I wonder if these things will go back, and it's difficult to see they will. There's just so much preference for less less ceremony, less formality around some of these issues. So even we have some stats that even says people who want an open casket, which used to be sort of the main way people had funerals, is still like the support for that is around 12%. So you can see these, just if you look back in the last 50 years, these are dramatic changes, I think, in people's attitudes as it relates to the category overall.
For sure.
And then if you look at things and then people's views around legacy and and how they look back at their own lives, we have stats that say 64% of people agree that we could do a better job of recognizing accomplishments in personal and professional lives, and and sharing family history. 75% of people agree that more family history should be shared, especially in times of loss as well. These are inflection points when people start thinking about these issues and the role of outstanding lives have had, of how they've impacted individuals personally as well. And these are all sort of times to reflect around those things. And I think you're seeing a lot of coalescing around less formality, more personalization, and all those things. And I think it's very progressive, and it's something that we've been tracking for a long time here at Kinwood. It's something that we're building products and services around as well.
For sure. So, Jeff, for the listeners, when we talk about legacy and family history, what advice would you have for people when they're starting to think about that?
I think the number one thing is, I think, is writing something down for people. I know on our website, on kinwood.ca, as part of the MAiD guide, we have a documenting, your legacy section where, there's a bunch of categories and questions you can ask yourselves around, how do I look at a life? What were the impacts of that life? What values did I have? What values did I pass along to my family? And even such things as, even very important family things that you think are part of your personal life. Like, what are my childhood home? What are the 3 or 4 homes we had? All of those things both have a important impact and place in your legacy and in your heart and in your family history. But they're also really important to, future generations. And I know the older you get, people become very, very curious and and where they come from. What were my ancestors? I'd love to be able to have a conversation with my great grandfather. Was he funny?
Mm.
But it's very difficult to have that information. But I think with modern technology today, to be able to document these stories is much easier than ever was before, and a lot of this content and information becomes really important family history.
For sure, for sure. And how does Kinwood offer that in terms of what you have set up?
I think we are a professional services company. We're in this category we're calling modern bereavement. But I think for the majority of people, there's all kinds of simple and free ways to be able to document your legacy, and that's from starting to write it down. I think a lot of people when they're coming to grips with MAiD or a potential loss, there's a lot of people that are going through old family photos and possessions and trying to come to grips and summarize what a particular life meant to them and what was the impact it made on society. So these are very, very personal reflections and feelings, and I think that the number one rule is really just is to write those feelings down, and whether that is just on a computer, in a notebook, on your phone, getting those feelings down. What were the values that I've come to learn from somebody who is either passed away or going to pass away, and be able to recount some of those to a MAiD patient is something that that a bereaved person may want to do. And it doesn't have to be very elaborate. It just, I think, really needs to be authentic. In terms of what we do, at Kinwood, we do custom celebration of life events. We do custom family films as well. So we'll get a camera at a home and we'll shoot 8 to 10 interviews and cut that and edit it with family photos and news clippings and any other video footage to come up with really compelling biographical films that recant a person's history in their life, but also the family history as well. So, and we've been in business for about a year and a half, and we're things are going very well. We're very busy these days. So.
Oh, that's wonderful. Well, thank you for sharing that. I think that's, really great advice when we're starting to think about, again, capturing that legacy and the history of who this individual is and what that brought to the family as a whole. And I think just spending time to document it and think about it and reflect and reminisce is also really good for all involved. And so I say thank you for you, thank you to you and to Kinwood for being one of those services that can help individuals to also put this together. And Jeff mentioned there the MAiD guide, and we'll talk about that in our next podcast when we sit down with Jeff and kind of review what that MAiD guide looks like and the development of that, and different points that people want to be mindful of as they are starting to prepare for MAiD. So thank you, Jeff, for coming on today, sort of talk about the public acceptance of MAiD and really how those societal attitudes really have changed over the history, and those cultural topics that really do collide with those moral and religious objections. So the conversation doesn't end here. We're going to, again, have Jeff on for a future podcast episode, and we'll welcome you back at any time. Thank you, Jeff, for sharing with all of our audience today.
Thanks, Lauren. And if anyone wants more information, our company's Kinwood, and it's at kinwood.ca. Thanks again.